In recent months, relations between Japan and China have reached one of their most acute moments since the end of World War II, and what just a couple of years ago seemed far removed from possible escalation is today taking on the contours of almost direct strategic rivalry. Between the two largest economies of the region, countries with deep histories, complex historical traumas, and intersecting interests, tension is growing at all levels: diplomatic, military, economic, and informational. On the surface, this is manifested in a series of sharp public attacks, canceled meetings, mutual protests, and suspicious incidents in air and maritime space. But beneath this lies a much deeper foundation: a conflict of interests around Taiwan, the strengthening of military presence, contradictions in economic interdependence, and the overall restructuring of the global order. It all began when the Japanese leadership, under pressure from domestic politics and rising regional risks, became much sharper in its language regarding Taiwan, the island to which Beijing lays territorial claims and which is viewed in Beijing as part of its inseparable territory. In Tokyo, such views on Taiwan are interpreted as a direct threat to national security, because any conflict in the Taiwan Strait would automatically affect Japan's southern flank and key maritime routes vital to the country's economy. These public statements by Japanese leaders became the first major irritant after which diplomatic relations began to deteriorate rapidly. China's reaction was predictably harsh. Beijing condemned the Japanese statements as interference in internal affairs, a violation of the principles of sovereignty, and incitement to the division of China. This was followed by warnings, official protests, and a refusal to engage in usual consultation formats. Starting in autumn 2025, diplomatic channels between the two countries effectively ceased to function in a normal mode. Japanese ambassadors received harsh démarches, Chinese diplomats were recalled for consultations, and planned high-level meetings were canceled one after another. However, this was only the first act of the conflict, and it is far deeper than it appears at first glance. The military dimension began to intensify noticeably, almost simultaneously, with the diplomatic cooling. In recent months, Japanese and Chinese military aircraft have increasingly crossed demarcation lines and entered zones controlled by the other side. Chinese combat aircraft carried out a series of close approaches to Japanese vessels and provoked radar activations at maximum range, causing irritation and concern in Tokyo. In practice, such maneuvers are seen in Japan as attempts to test reactions and deliberate escalation of tension. Similarly, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force has increased the number of flights in the East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, which Beijing perceives as a demonstration of support for Taiwan and therefore as a direct threat to China's national interests. These incidents are far from rare, but their frequency and scale have risen to levels close to the threshold of open conflict, and virtually each side views the actions of the other as provocations. The economic side of the confrontation is also keeping pace. Japan is a major trading partner of China, and their economies are deeply intertwined, especially in industrial supplies, electronics, and automotive components. However, as political tension grows, more and more Japanese companies and politicians are expressing concern about dependence on Chinese supply chains, particularly in strategic sectors such as semiconductors and rare earth metals. China uses this as an element of economic pressure, periodically imposing restrictions on rare earth exports that are critically important for Japan's high-tech industry. Such measures are perceived in Tokyo not only as an economic weapon, but also as an attempt to limit Japan's strategic autonomy, which leads to a further deterioration of relations. Against this background, interaction with the United States has become another factor that strongly shifts the geopolitical balance. The United States, responding to the growing threat from China, has made Japan a key element of its strategy in the Indo-Pacific region, increasing joint exercises, deliveries of defense equipment, and political support. This, in turn, is perceived in Beijing as pushing Japan into the role of a forward outpost against China, making Tokyo an even more visible participant in the confrontation, rather than a neutral mediator. In Beijing, this causes growing irritation, which officials express through state media and diplomatic channels, emphasizing that any attempts to create an anti-China front will meet a tough response. China's ruling circles, according to sources in international analytical centers, view the current relationship not simply as a crisis between two countries, but as part of a broader conflict over the redistribution of influence in Asia and the world. This contradiction goes beyond a simple Japan-China confrontation. It has become a symbol of the changing balance of power between East and West, where each side is increasingly building alliances, strengthening military capabilities, and restructuring economic chains. Within Japan, political pressure is growing on the government to preserve sovereignty and avoid compromises that could be perceived as concessions to Chinese interests. Similarly, in China, the strengthening of nationalist sentiments and rhetoric about protecting territorial integrity are becoming tools for consolidating domestic support, even if this means a further deterioration of relations with foreign powers. As a result, diplomatic coolness is turning into a state of mutual strategic distrust, in which each side perceives the actions of the other as a potential step toward open conflict. Despite the fact that an open military conflict between Japan and China has not officially begun, the situation is close to a threshold where even the slightest unintended clash could escalate into a much larger confrontation. And the world, especially Asia, is closely watching what next steps these two powers will take, because this could determine not only regional, but also global security for years to come. Against this background, more and more military analysts are beginning to say that Japan and China have in fact approached a dangerous line beyond which any local incident could trigger a chain reaction that would be extremely difficult to stop. This is not about a deliberate decision to start a war, but about a classic scenario of escalation by mistake, where harsh rhetoric, constant maneuvers, and demonstrations of force create an environment in which the probability of an incident rises sharply. One wrong maneuver in the air, a pilot's error, a communications failure, or an overly aggressive interpretation of an opponent's actions, and the crisis instantly slips out of diplomatic control. This is precisely what is most feared today in Tokyo and Beijing, even though publicly neither side admits it. Experts emphasize that both countries are rapidly preparing for exactly such a scenario. Japan is increasing defense spending, expanding the capabilities of its self-defense forces, and strengthening its southern islands, while China is reinforcing its military presence in the East China Sea and around Taiwan, demonstrating readiness to act forcefully. At the same time, each side is convinced that it is acting defensively and that the aggressor is the opposing side. This is a vicious circle in which any increase in security by one side is automatically perceived as a threat by the other. Against the backdrop of weakening global deterrence mechanisms and a crisis of trust between major powers, this region is becoming one of the most vulnerable points on the world map. Increasingly, the view is voiced that Japan and China are already living in a state of pre-war tension, where peace is maintained not by stable agreements, but by a fragile balance and mutual fear of the consequences. And this is precisely the main danger of the current moment. The longer such a condition persists, the higher the probability that one day this balance will be broken, not because of strategic calculation, but because of a mistake, an impulsive decision, or an event for which neither side was formally prepared.